Good morning, AP Euro. We're almost there. We're almost at the test. And again, what I want you to do is continue to organize your notes. Very, very important so you can recognize the documents and tie them to the periods. And also become familiar with the rubric of the DBQ. You must use, there are going to be 5 documents for 45 minutes. So I would try to use at least 4 of the 5. I would use the 5 if possible, but I would certainly use 4 out of 5. What you need to do is to to answer the question. Your thesis must answer the question and then support the thesis with the documents. As long as you recognize the period that the documents are talking about, you should be able, with your notes, to develop a 4 or 5 point essay. I don't think that I think this is an easier test than the long essay. So I'm glad that the AP will be testing this way. Again, make sure that you have done your organization. I need you to hand that in by, or at least show me, by Friday. You need to have access to your notes, and I think a timeline of European history from about 1400 to about 1900, maybe World War One, would be a very good tool for you to have during the test. So I need you to hand that in by Friday. The deadline will be Friday, and that will be an assessment grade for you. It may be the only assessment grade that I put in this cycle. Make sure that you're doing that and that you do this on time. This is the one deadline that I'm going to hold to more strictly than others. Okay. All right. Also, I need you to be focused on the themes of the AP examination. That is, how Europe affected the rest of the world. Well, there are obviously issues there that you should be familiar with. How Europe affected the rest of the world, certainly the age of exploration and conquest, imperialism, negative in some ways, but consequential. That is, the West did spread its views, its values, its political systems to the rest of the world. You should be familiar with that, and that's basically, if the question deals with that, you should be able to recognize it. I do believe that they will try to bring in some question in terms of disease and how it impacts history. I can think of 2 basic periods where that might be likely. That is the Renaissance, the period before the Renaissance. How does the Renaissance emerge? One of the key causes of the Renaissance is the Black Death. That plague killed about 30% of Europeans, but it freed up labor. Peasants were not held to the land as tightly after that as they had been before. Social controls were loosened, weakened. Peasants headed into the cities, particularly early on in the Italian peninsula, and began to move wealth from the land to commercial activities. That is, they began to create a proto-bourgeoisie. This proto-bourgeoisie was strengthened by the monopoly that the Turks established in Silk Road trade, and also were motivated to seek new understandings, new ideologies. So this is where the changes of government comes in as a theme. That is, they began to look for classical forms of government, not tied to the old feudal order, which they were emerging from. So they looked back to the classical period. They were inspired by scholars leaving Constantinople after the Turkish conquest in 1453, who brought over Greek, Latin classics that were lost to the West, and they began to develop what is later known as humanism. Remember, the principal proponent of humanism is Pico de la Mirandola, and he talks about the man having a role based on God's gifts to man, that is reason and logic, and looking for themselves to determine what is and isn't true. The human being becomes the center of focus, not the spiritual. The secular, the living, the life itself becomes the focal point. Therefore, you have perspective in art. You have writings that deal with the human condition, in some ways rejecting the authority of the church. Think about Boccaccio and Decameron. He wrote that during the plague. Basically, these are Florentine elites who basically isolate themselves. They go into quarantine and they tell each other stories, some of which are very critical of the church and point to almost salacious. That is, that they talk about the hypocrisy of the church. You have priests who chase after women, monks who chase after women, priests who get drunk, and Boccaccio is arguing against the authority of the church in a literal form. You also have Machiavelli, who then divorces political action from Christian morality. That is, when he writes The Prince, he says it is better to be feared than to be loved. Well, that is a rejection of Christian ethics in political action. He says that the only measure of political activity or policy by a prince is success, not ethical morality. This establishes Machiavelli as the first kind of naturalist or humanist in political philosophy. So make sure that you have that. The other one that I can think of is basically the age of exploration and conquest, where European diseases basically wiped out most of the indigenous people and allowed the Europeans to replace, or at least create, a hybrid culture with much more ease. In fact, the reaction to the European diseases by indigenous people suggests that they saw their gods as impotent in defending their interest against the new god of the Europeans. Therefore, they became much more willing to accept Roman Catholicism in the case of the Spanish and Portuguese conquest. That is a way in which Europeans certainly affected the rest of the world. Change in politics, you can see it going from a feudal, God-centered political system where politics and religion are the same thing, to one that is secular, based on liberal ideas and then radical ideas of popular participation. I will go over more of these themes as we go closer to the test. Remember to hand in the assignment. Bye.